When Annie got home late from work, having it just made in time to the bakery to pick up Tim's birthday cake, she was surprised and annoyed to discover a cake already on the kitchen counter. Speechless, she stumbled under the weight of her bags and own cake box as she approached. She sat down her white box carefully beside the unexpected one, freed down her bags, and dug out her phone. She unlocked it and brought up her text thread with Tim. Started to type, all ready to absolutely let him have it, but then deleted it all and stared at the cake. Again. It was his birthday, after all, but what the heck was with this cake? It was really big. 3 tiers, thick white frosting with rainbow piping and sprinkles. It looked like a kid's birthday cake. Was it some kind of joke? A movie reference she wasn't catching? Annie pierced her lips and looked at the box from Baby Cakes, which held the custom order she had placed with malicious security. It was one of those hyper-realistically decorated cakes, and it was made to look like their Nintendo Switch. He had always been fascinated with animals who were able to camouflage themselves. Spiders that was like a dewdrop of bird poop, stick insects, little geckos that blended perfectly with the bark of a tree. So the latest trend for cakes that looked like other things, especially if they weren't food, was a given for Tim. He must have sent her 100 pictures of knives cutting into a photorealistic PlayStation, phones, microwaves, suitcases, chess sets, and piggy banks. It had been her plan to swap the device out for the cake before Tim got home and casually challenge him to a game to make him try to pick it up. But if he'd already got himself a huge cake, maybe she'd wasted her time. She huffed and typed, "Hey dork, who buys themselves a massive birthday cake like that? You ruined my surprise. I guess more cake is better than less cake." Annie decided she may as well see her plan through. She hid the switch in the eye-lined cupboard and carried the cake box into the living room. This part would take some careful navigating. She would have to slide the switch cake up out of the box onto the table without jacking up the delicate format. The slightest damage and the illusion would be ruined. A spatula, maybe? Annie muttered to herself. She pushed herself to her feet and jogged back into the kitchen to rummage in the second drawer. The surprise cake caught her eye again, and she shook her head, mystified. It wasn't even on a plate. Tim had left it sitting directly on the bare countertop. She made a mental note not to eat any cake from the bottom layer and made a beeline back to the coffee table. The plastic spatula slid under the switch cake easily, and she leaved it onto the surface of the table in one smooth motion, sucking in a sharp breath as it bowed, but it didn't blend. Once the cake was in position, she didn't try to rearrange it. "That will have to do," she shrugged. A noise came from the kitchen, and Annie croaked her head. Sometimes noises from the neighbor's house echoed and sounded like someone was in their house, but this didn't sound like that. It sounded like something fell. "Tim?" Annie called. "Are you home?" She frowned at the receding silence. Her text to Tim was unanswered. Now that the cake was in place, the next order of business was to get out of her work clothes and make a cup of tea. She shrugged off the polyester work polo and black jeans and combo and sighed with relief while getting into a comfortable pair of tights and slouchy sweater, which she immediately pulled up to her elbows. Tim couldn't be long. If he beat her home with that ridiculous cake, then he must have just nipped back out for some last minute dinner craving. Traditionally, They always ordered Chinese on Tim's birthday. But who knew? Maybe Tim wanted to celebrate entering his 30s by trying something new. The cake was gone. Annie stared at the empty countertop. There wasn't even a smear on the laminate where the frosting had touched it. It was like there had never been a cake there at all. She was still examining the kitchen for evidence 5 minutes later when Tim bursted through the door, red-faced and apologetic. A couple of the guys from work had taken him for a beer for his birthday, and he'd lost track of time. But, he added breathlessly, I placed the Chinese order on the way home, so it shouldn't be too much longer. Sorry. Again. Annie shook her head at him. It's fine. I'm not worried about that. What was the deal with that cake? What cake? The big one. Really fancy, like for a kid's party. You just left it on the counter. Like right here? She used her hands to mimic a cake shape in the air where it had been. Tim gave the counter an exaggerated inspection. It was clearly devoid of any cake. He looked back at her with a raised eyebrow. Well, where is it now? I don't know. Annie could hear herself getting pitchy. I thought you must have dropped it off and gone back out. But now it's gone again and the sliding door is open. Tim pointed over her shoulder. Annie whistled around. Sure enough, the door out to the tiny patio and garden, squashed against their neighbor's equally tiny garden, was open. Maybe it was Rob. Tim shrugged bitterly. Maybe he was hiding the cake from his kid. In our house? He has our spare key. He probably didn't think we'd ever eat. He probably didn't think we'd ever know he'd been in. Annie didn't like it. She didn't like how fine Tim was with it. Just pleased to come up with a tidy explanation. The thing that bothered her was he didn't understand about the cake not being on a plate. How unsettling it was that it was just sitting directly on the countertop like that. Want to watch something till the food gets here? Tim asked, already walking into the living room. Want to verse me in Mario Kart? Annie called after him. Sure. Annie followed, already anticipating his reaction, but she was momentarily distracted by a skittering sound in the hallway. Is this cake? Ha! Yes! Annie laughed and went to see Tim's delighted face over the switch cake, which was now ruined from where he had tried, unsuccessfully, to pick it up. His hands were covered in mashed up cake, and he was holding the red bundle controller up to his mouth already. Can we eat it now? It's your birthday. He looked around. Can we still play the switch? We can still play the switch, right? Of course. I'll go get it. You stay there, cake fingers. Annie opened the line cupboard to retrieve the real switch and almost dropped it because this time the sound was right behind her. She turned around, but nothing was there. We better not have mice, Annie said to Tim as she returned and slid the real switch into the dock. We don't have any money for an exterminator. I spent it all on a switch cake. The cake was on their bed. Oh, Tim said, deadpan. That would be the cake. That would be the cake then? Did you? No. Did you? No, I was with you all night. Annie could feel the first flutterings of something that wasn't quite panic, but was definitely more than just stress. Do you still think Rob is hiding cake in our house? It would be out of character, Tim said, less confident of his theory now that the beer had worn off. He leaned forward. What are you doing? I'm going to pick it up. Annie couldn't articulate why the thought of that alarmed her the thought that alarmed her so much. Can a cake have bad vibes? Tim considered her question and the cake on their bed. I think anything outside of its usual context assumes a sinister aura. It's not just a cake, it's a cake where it doesn't belong. It's wrong cake. He grinned at her. I still want to eat it. Annie wiggled her nose. I don't know if I want wrong cake. Tim started forward again and put his hands out to slide his fingers under the base of the cake. Senselessly, two shocking noises filled the air. The cake let out a hideous screeching noise, like a whistling kettle mixed with a yodeling cat, and Tim began to scream. Before Eddie could react to the awful noise, Tim lurched back, blood spraying from his hands, and the cake on the bed seemed to unfurl, to segment, to become something with too many legs and run! Scream! Annie pulled Tim, stumbling and bleeding, from from the bedroom and into the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind them. On the other side of the door, on the hardwood floors, they could hear the currying, squiggling of the cake thing. Kitch, kitch, kitch. Squeak! In the bright light and against the sharp white tiles of the bathroom, Tim's mangled hands looked like something they would scoff at in a horror movie as being over the top. Tim was staring at his own hands with a kind of glassy detachment, which Annie took to mean that he was going into shock. He didn't respond when she called his name. He just shook and stared at his hands. There was so much blood. Annie grabbed the two towels off the towel rack and bundled Tim's hands. It looked like he was carrying two big beehives. And then she pushed him until he was sitting on the floor with his big beehive hands tucked in his lap. She dug her phone out of her pocket and dialed emergency services. It took a long time to get the responder to understand her, past the sound quality in the bathroom and the racket the cake was making outside the room. She wasn't even sure how they would get to the ambulance. But she would cross that bridge, she supposed. When it arrived, outside in the hall, the cake thing was still skittering back and forth and occasionally hurtling itself at the bathroom door. Judging by the sound it was making, it was not as soft as it looked. I'm going to try to get a knife or something, Annie said to Tim. He didn't respond. She nodded to herself and, with only a little guilt, dilated her next-door neighbor's number. Annie? Rob answered, sounding confused. Is everything okay over there? Actually, I could use some help if you've got a minute, Rob. Annie tried to keep her voice even and sane. There's a animal in the house and it bit Tim. We thought we heard weird noises. Rob and his wife always said we. What can we do for you? Does Tim need a ride to the hospital? Squeak! Is the animal still there? What is that? Annie ignored both questions. Can you come over? I need you to come in from my patio door. It's unlocked, but bring a baseball bat or a cricket bat. Something like that, okay? It's really aggressive. Well, okay, I'll be there in a minute, Rob said, sounding like he'd rather do literally anything else. Annie could hear Deb, his wife, in the background asking questions. There was nothing for Annie to do while she waited for Rob except to listen to the crack of the cake thing's progress along the hall and watch the spread of the blood as it slowly soaked the towels swaddling Tim's hands. It was taking forever. Maybe he wasn't competing. She finally heard the swoosh of the sliding glass door, and Rob began to call out, Annie, where is Ugh? What is? And then the screaming and screeching began. Annie didn't hesitate. She threw open the bathroom door and barbed into the kitchen. She grabbed the big craving knife from the pneumatic rack and turned to the living room. There was blood everywhere. Rob was struggling on the floor, where it looked like a birthday cake had exploded out of him. But it was actually because the creature was trying to crawl inside of but it was actually because the creature was trying to crawl inside him. Annie stopped for a moment, tried to process what was she saying. Crab? Crab? Spider? She wheeled in disbelief as she crocked the tennis racket on the floor. Loose list by Rod Spanzeming hand. What did he think he was going to do with a tennis racket? Having said that, how is the knife in her hand going to be of any use? Cringing from the gore of her still struggling neighbor, Annie searched for a place between the plates covering the cake thing's body where she could slide the knife. She found an opening as it squirmed deeper into Rob's stomach. It was focused so completely on burrowing into his abdomen, it hadn't noticed her approach. She could hear the ripping sounds inside him and saw his eyes rolling in their sockets. Annie plunged the knife in between the in between the arranged plates, which looked so much like pieces of cake, into the fleshy webbing, and the creature bucked and wibbled like it was being electrocuted. A burning gouge of hot blood splashed across the back of her hand as she tried to twist the knife deeper. It really was burning. Annie let go of the knife. Her hand felt like it had been dipped in acid, clenched in a rictus, and as the sticky blood seared her skin, a bubbly rash was already speeding up her forearm. Jesus frickin' Christ! Annie sobbed as she stumbled back to the kitchen. Behind her, the cake, still with the sizzling knife sticking out of it, was clumsily backing away from Rob's limp body and staggering after her. It gave a furious, bolting hiss and charged, but Annie kicked it back. She was gratified to see it so off balance. She managed to knock it over and went back to frantically mimicking for the fridge door for the barbecue lighter. And Annie crowed. You're in for it now. In her handbag at her feet, where she dropped it when she got home, was a spray can of deodorant. This better work like it does in the movies. As the cake lurched to its feet and prepared to attack again, Annie fumbled the ignition switch on the lighter and sprayed the deodorant. Her screech almost matched with the cake's as the burst of flames scorched both of them. Her burnt hand, a gory mess of sticky, burnt flesh, dropped the can, and she frantically grabbed it. But the cake was already on fire. Scream! It carried madly around her living room, igniting everything it touched. Annie knew there was nothing she could do about it now. She fled to the bathroom, got Tim up off the floor, and half dragged him past the info their house was turning into and out the front door. Annie! Rob's wife, Deb, shouted to her from her own front lawn. She was wrapped in a fluffy pink dressing gown. Her daughter clung to her leg. The little girl stared at Auntie's blaring house with wide, unpreparing eyes. Where's Rob? Is he still in there? Annie! Annie, when she released her grip on Tim, simply slumped to the ground like a sack of potatoes, could only stare at her, numb. In the distance, sirens.